Good morning. This is the Sharp Knife Woman, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about beginning steps in beadwork. And this video was prompted by a good friend of mine, so Rusty, this one's for you. The question he had asked me was, how do you get your beads to be straight and even as you're putting them on your material? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what some of my tips and techniques are for just basic lazy stitch beadwork. Okay, so first of all, picking your material. I prefer to use brain tan. In fact, I use almost exclusively brain tan. Occasionally I do some stuff with wool, but the technique is going to be the same whether you're using brain tan or wool. You want to choose the best hide for your project. When you pick a hide, you always want to make sure that you take a needle and that you test your hide. Make sure that when you buy a brain tan that you're going to be beading, that you can actually stick your needle through. It should just go right through. It should feel super soft, easy. You shouldn't be forcing it. If you have to force your needle through the leather, you're going to end up breaking a lot of needles and you're going to get very frustrated. So pick a high quality brain tan that has really nice, supple, the softer it is, the happier you're going to be. Okay, it should be just basically like beading on cloth. Now, one of the first tips I'm going to give you on making sure that your project is straight and smooth is I actually take and I put a piece of painter's tape, just a simple blue or green painter's tape on the back of the leather. Lay your leather back down, face down on the table. You always want to bead on the hair side. You always want to have the flesh side towards your skin, especially on clothing. But you always want to have that hair side out. That's the pretty side of the hide. So you're going to lay that down. You're going to put some tape on it. You're going to take just a strip of that, and you're going to make sure that you lay it on there flat. It holds the leather straight as you're beading it. It won't slip. It won't gap. It won't twist. Just gives you a much nicer, smoother surface to bead on. My second tip is going to be that you want to make sure that then as you plan your design that you mark where you're going to be doing your first row of beadwork with a marker. And I use, not very traditional, but a very fine brown Sharpie marker. Works terrific because you can lay a very nice, very light line on there that hardly shows at all. You can see it, but unless you're really close and looking at it, you're not really going to find it. Make sure you don't lay it on too heavy because it will get dark and then you will be able to see it a little bit more, but we're going to cover that up with beads anyway. So just I took a ruler and I drew a line here. I also marked, and they're a little darker, a little too dark, but where my designs are going to be on this hat band. This is just a single row hat band. It's pretty simple, but this is what the design features are. You can see I started it in the middle so I could figure out exactly how the crosses were going to lay out and make it work. I've made sure I leave at least a 1/4 inch margin along the beginning here. That's important because it gives you lots of room to work with. You can go back and trim that off later. I also leave the whole thing, even though I'm only doing 1 row of beadwork, I leave it on the hide because it's easier to bead while it's on there. If I cut a narrow strip and attempted to bead it, it would be almost impossible to make it look good. Doing it this way, I'll have a perfect roll of beadwork, I trim it out, and I have a very nice hat band. What I'll do once I'm done is I'll just trim it right along this edge. It gives me the perfect edge for the next hat band, so I can just continue making hat bands and make good use of my hide. Maximizing these expensive hides is pretty important. Okay, so I am using a standard beading needle. I believe this is a size 10 or size 11. You can get beading needles according to the size of bead that you're using. I'm using a standard nimmo beading thread. This is a nylon beading thread that's actually very durable. It wears very well. I like to use it when client is going to be using their piece. If they're going to be wearing their moccasins, in this case they're going to be wearing and using their hat band on a regular basis. Don't want those beads coming off of there. What I'm doing right now is waxing the thread. I have just a basic piece of beeswax. This actually comes in, with any place that sells beading supplies. Pretty standard. Just going to pull it through there, make sure it's well coated. What that wax does is it makes sure that the thread slides and it gets less tangled, it gets less knotted. Most thread has a tendency to get tangled as you are sewing and using it, and that wax definitely helps keep it a little stiffer and it gets a little less tangled. So, big benefit. You also want to wax if you're using a linen or a cotton or a silk thread. Those tend to get knots and tangle even easier than this nimmo. So, just make sure you got that well coated. I'm going to get a little bit there on the end. So I've got my thread well coated. Got my double knot in the end. I'm using a double thickness of thread. And I'm just going to very carefully singe that knot down to the knot so that it is melted together, and that is not going to come untied. I'm going to take it and I'm going to test it. That's a pretty solid knot. And so that's also a nice small knot. It's going to sit nice and flush against the leather once we put it on there. And I'm going to talk a minute about my beadboard because it's something that a lot of people have really enjoyed seeing. My little beadboard is probably, I don't know, 8 by 10. I took some standard edging, put it on there. It helps keep the beads from rolling around. Put some cloth in there. Simply put some finishing nails on the inside and the outside of those. Put some finishing nails on the top and the sides. Hold that edging in place. These are very handy because you can move them around. You can put them on the table while you're working on your project, and then you can move them and put them somewhere where they won't get disturbed until you're ready to work on your project again. So I like it because it's just like a little portable desk. I can keep my scissors, I can keep my wax, I can keep everything right there. And I'm going to find my leather just about where the end of that first line is. I want to go ahead and eyeball it. I'm going to put my needle just on the outside. Here's the line. I put my needle just to the outside of that line slightly, and just above the end, so that it's covering up the line, but it gives me a good guide and a good gauge. And then from where I started that's where I will start the beginning of each of those rows subsequently. Okay. I'm also going to only take my needle and put it through the top part of the hide. I do not go all the way through. If you go all the way through, one of the main things that can happen is that thread easily catches on things and rubs and wears, and it's just not, the beadwork doesn't last as long. This is the way the natives did it, and that's the way I do it, is they went through the top part. One of the great things about Braintown is it really does hold. Okay, so the first row, I'm going to go ahead and put on this row of red. Now, most plains beadwork has rows of 5, 7, or 9 beads. This particular piece, however, because I'm using that cross design, in order to get the cross design had to have 10 beads, so I'm going to put a row of 10 beads on there. What I did is I just scooped them up, and they're now on my thread. I'll show you my beadboard here in a minute. But as you can see, I've just laid those across there. I'm going to hold them flat with my thumb and pull them tight. And then I'm going to use my fingernail to mark kind of the edge of where those are. And then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to go just outside of where my fingernail is. Don't go too close to the beads because you'll end up with a row that kind of pooches. But you don't want to be too far away where the thread shows either. So you got to just kind of gauge just right outside that so that row lays nice and flat on that leather. Now if you've gauged it right this other way, hopefully your thread is also coming out where the next row should start. And so then you're just going to go ahead and add the next row. Because of how I'm trying to film this, I've got my bead board on the wrong side. Usually I have it on the left so I can scoop those up a little easier. But right now, so now I'm looking at that, and I hate it because it's too far apart. So I am going to change that. Chances are you'll do this a number of times where you will go back and forth. If you pull that leather tight, you should be able to pull the needle back through. So never fear, you can undo the stitch. Okay, and again, making sure if I catch too much, I back it out. Making sure I line it up evenly. That next row. I always check it. If I don't like it, I pull it out and go over again. Sometimes the beads might be too big, too small, not really fit the row too well, and in that case you'll want to search through and find the beads that fit. Especially old style, old color, antique beads often are irregular, and so then it becomes much more of a chore to plan the rows or to make them more even. Your greasy yellows, for instance, are just always a very irregular size. Okay, so there we go. See, and I'm just placing that thread to the outside of that line. See how that thread's pooching out there? I want to make sure I pull that tight so you don't have any empty threads. My rows are laying out pretty even and flat. I've been eyeballing to make sure that as I add it here that it's even with the one before it, and here is even with the one before it. And even though I have different colors of beads, they seem to be laying out there pretty flat, so that's nice. I'm going to put just a couple more rows on here so that you can see how this works. And then I'm going to show you how to tie off, because how I end my thread is also fairly important. So I'm getting down to where I'm pretty happy with what we're looking at, and I'm going to show you how to tie off. But as I add this blue row, I realize that those beads are a little bigger than the others, and I don't really want that row to be way out there like that. So I'm actually going to pull these two fat beads off the end. And I'm going to grab two skinnier beads. I'm going to try them. Sometimes, like I said, you have to kind of play with it. That looks a little better. Again, lining my needle up directly. Making sure I pick up just enough leather. Pulling it through.
Make sure each time that I double count my beads, make sure I have the right number. Go. Now actually, as I look at it, I'm getting pretty close to the end of my thread. So what I'm going to actually do is finish it off. So instead of putting it out where I want the next row to start, I'm going to put the beads on here. Make sure we're good to go. I'm just going to have a fatty. I'm going to find a skinny one for the end. Over here out of the way. There we go. And so when I put this in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in where I want that row to end. I'm going to come out in the middle of future rows. Okay, and that row looks pretty good. So what I'm now going to do is just make several small stitches in the leather right there. Not really visible. Very secure. That's not going to unravel. That leather will hold that thread. There's nothing to rub on it or to create any friction to make it unravel. Okay. So, there you have it. Basic lazy stitch beadwork. Not too hard to do. Fairly straight and even. And make sure you're using the line to help there, and then you're going to be eyeballing it on this side. As you get to the doing patterns, this is what you're going to end up with.
So anyway, I hope this has been helpful. Let me know in the comments below. I can addend as necessary, and love to hear other people's tips. And so, everybody have a great afternoon. Thanks for watching.